I want to start by saying that I'm not someone who tells stories like this. I'm not on forums. I don't post things online. I've never been the kind of person who calls into radio shows at midnight to talk about weird experiences. Most of my life has been pretty unremarkable by design because remarkable things cost you, and I've never had a lot to spend. So if you're listening to this, understand that it took me a while to get here. It took me a few years of sitting on what I know, a few years of trying to file it under strange job, strange town, forget about it, before I accepted that I couldn't file it anywhere. It doesn't stay filed. It comes back when I'm doing dishes or driving through rain or walking down a long hallway somewhere with fluorescent lights overhead. It comes back and I have to go through it again, piece by piece, trying to find the angle that makes it make sense. I haven't found it yet. What I can do is tell it as accurately as I remember it. That's all I can offer. Just the events, more or less in order, with as much honesty as I can manage about what I was thinking, what I was feeling, and where I went wrong. Because I did go wrong somewhere in there. I made choices I can't fully defend, but I was tired and I needed the money. And I told myself it was nothing. That's the honest beginning of it. Exhaustion and money. Almost every mistake I've ever made started there. The year was 2019. I was 34 years old and I was broke in the specific way that feels different from being young. And broke the way where you're old enough to know exactly how you got there and too tired to pretend it's temporary. I had a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus that I couldn't really afford alone, and I was alone because my girlfriend of 3 years, Maya, had moved out in February. Not dramatically, she just left. Said she needed something more stable, and I understood what she meant, because I didn't have an argument against it. I was working part-time at a distribution warehouse outside the city and picking up odd jobs when they came moving furniture, painting garage floors, whatever anyone would pay for. I was behind on rent by a month. Not 2, not 3, just 1. 1 month, which a lot of people would say isn't that bad, and they'd be right, except when you're 1 month behind, you're also constantly spending the current month's income catching up to the last month, which means you're always looking at the next month with nothing in your hands. It's a treadmill that never actually gets you anywhere, and the only way off is to find more money somewhere. Fast. The ad I found was on a local job site I checked every couple of days. It wasn't anything elaborate. Just a posting from a cleaning contractor, a company called Meridian Facility Services, which sounded bigger than it probably was looking for overnight cleaners with their own transportation. The work was at various commercial locations throughout the county. Pay was $15 an hour, which in 2019 was decent for that kind of work. The hours were 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 4 nights a week. They wanted people who could work independently, didn't mind quiet environments, and had a reliable vehicle. I called the number the same morning I saw it. The man who answered was named Dale Pritchard. He talked fast and moved on quickly from my questions, which I noted but didn't dwell on. He asked if I had any prior cleaning experience. I had some. From a hotel job I'd worked briefly in my late 20s, and he asked about my vehicle, which at the time was a 2009 Civic with a rust spot above the rear wheel well. I told him it ran fine. He said that was all he needed to know. He gave me an address and told me to come in 2 days later at 9 in the evening for orientation. The address he gave me was about 45 minutes east of Columbus in a town called Orrton. I want to describe Orrton because I think it matters. It's the kind of place that's easy to drive through without really seeing a 2-lane main street, a few gas stations, a couple of churches. some houses pushed back into small yards, a grain elevator visible from the highway. Population, I later looked it up, was around 4,000. It had the feeling of a town that peaked sometime in the 70s and had been gently, quietly declining ever since, not dramatically enough to make news, just steadily losing pieces of itself the way old photographs fade at the edges. The theater was on the main street. It was called the Orrton Rex, and it had been built in 1948 according to the cornerstone I noticed on my first night there. The marquee out front still worked, in the sense that the letters were still changeable and somebody changed them occasionally, but the frame around it had gone dark. Half the bulbs burned out, the other half a yellowish color that made the whole sign look faintly jaundiced. When I arrived that first evening, the marquee said, "Coming soon, Family Classics Revival." It had been saying that for a while, as I would come to understand. The theater had 4 auditoriums. The original single-screen main hall, which was large and had high ceilings and an ornate plasterwork border that was probably beautiful once and was now patchy and water-stained, and 3 smaller auditoriums that had been added in a renovation sometime in the late 80s. There was a wide lobby with a concession stand that still operated during the day. The theater was technically still open, showing films on weekends and occasionally on weeknights, and a small manager's office tucked behind the concession counter, and hallways that led back to the auditoriums and the utility areas and the projection booth. Dale met me in the parking lot. He was in his mid-50s, a compact man with the kind of face that looked like it had made a decision early on to stop expressing much. Not unfriendly, just efficient about it. He wore a gray fleece jacket and work boots, and he was carrying a clipboard. And when he saw my car, he looked at it the way a man looks at something he's assessed and moved on from. He shook my hand and got to it. He walked me through the building while the last of the evening light was still happening outside. It was March, cold and damp, and the theater had that particular smell of old buildings and cold weather dust, and something slightly chemical, like old adhesive, and underneath that the specific sweetness of stale popcorn that never really leaves a movie theater no matter how many times you clean it. That smell lives in the walls. The concession stand had a popcorn machine that was off for the night, glass foggy from the inside. The candy display case still had things in it, boxes of Junior Mints, some Twizzlers, a few packs of Raisinets. But they were dusty, and the prices on the little cards below each item were from a while ago. Nobody had adjusted those. Behind the counter, a soda fountain, and a warming lamp over an empty nacho tray. Dale showed me the supply closet, which was between the lobby restrooms and the entrance hallway. He showed me where the mop sink was, where the trash bags were stored, where the extra paper towels and toilet paper lived. He gave me a laminated sheet with a checklist on it. Restrooms, lobby, concession area, Auditorium 1, Auditorium 2, Auditorium 3. 5 main zones to be completed each night before 6 a.m., though in practice he said it rarely took more than 4 hours for someone working at a reasonable pace. Then we walked back toward the auditoriums. The hallway back there was carpeted in something that had probably been red once and was now a faded brownish maroon, with a pattern that might have been geometric at some point but had worn down to an impression of a pattern. The exit signs gave off their green light. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed very faintly, a sound you had to be still to hear, but that was always there. He pointed to Auditorium 1, 2, 3, standard-sized rooms, stadium seating in the 2 newer ones, traditional rows in the original main hall. Then he pointed to a door at the far end of the hallway. It was a heavier door than the others. The others had push-bar handles, the kind that opened theaters and schools everywhere in America. This one had a regular knob. The knob was brass, or had been, and it was tarnished now to a dull yellowish brown. There was a sign taped to the door at eye level, laser printed on plain paper and taped with wide, clear tape that had gone slightly yellow at the edges. The sign said, Auditorium 4, closed for renovation. Do not enter. That's 4, Dale said, which was not exactly the most informative thing he could have said. What's in there? I asked. Closed for renovation? He said, as if he was reading the sign rather than answering a question. Has been for a while. You don't go in there? Don't try the door, don't mess with it, just skip it on your checklist. I looked at the door. It looked like any other door. The carpet in front of it was worn in the same way as the rest of the hallway. Is someone working on it? Should I be aware of contractors or anything during my shift? Dale looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite impatience and wasn't quite warning. It was somewhere between those things. No contractors during overnight hours. Nobody's in there. It's just closed. Skip it, that's all. All right, I said. That was the extent of the orientation. He handed me a set of keys, one for the building's rear door, one for the supply closet, one for the projection booth, which he said I might need to access once in a while for overhead bulb issues, and a paper with his cell number and the number of a woman named Carol, who was the theater's day manager. He told me my first solo night would be the following Thursday, and he'd have someone with me for the first 2 nights to show me the routine. The someone he sent was a man named Terrence, who went by Terry and had been working for Meridian for about 2 years. Terry was maybe 40, black, broad-shouldered, quiet. He wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't chatty either, which suited both of us, I think. We were there to clean a building, not to become friends. He showed me the order he worked in: lobby and restrooms first, then concession area, then auditoriums 2 and 3, then auditorium 1, which took the longest because it was the biggest. He was thorough without being obsessive, which I respected. On the first of my 2 training nights, he moved through the building with the practiced disinterest of someone who had made peace with his surroundings. He mopped lobby floors, wiped down counters, swept out the auditoriums, replaced trash liners, spot-cleaned seat backs when something had been spilled. He worked steadily and didn't linger anywhere or move through any room, as if he had feelings about it. I noticed that he never went near door 4, not once. He walked to the end of the hallway to get to the supply cart, and he passed the door, but he walked with his face forward and his pace unchanged, and he never looked at it. Not even the casual glance you'd give any door in your environment. What's the deal with 4? I asked him around 1 in the morning on the second training night. We were sweeping out Auditorium 3, and it was quiet, except for the ventilation system pushing air through the overhead vents. Terry swept a clump of popcorn toward the central aisle and looked at it. Closed, he said. Dale said it's been closed for a while. How long? Since I started. A pause. Probably longer. What's wrong with it? He picked up the popcorn with his dustpan and looked at the dustpan for a moment, then looked at me. I don't ask about it, he said. It's not my job to ask about it. There was something in the way he said it that I noticed, not a warning exactly, more like a preference stated very firmly. I let it go. We finished the auditorium and moved on. He didn't mention it again, and neither did I. And when my 2 training nights were done, I was on my own. My solo schedule was Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday nights, 10 to 6. The theater was closed Sundays and Mondays and had limited hours Tuesday and Wednesday, so by the time I arrived, it was always fully empty, except for whatever the day crew had left behind: lights, on-timers, the occasional appliance that hummed in the dark. The echo of a building that's used to being occupied and isn't quite sure what to do with the quiet. I want to describe what it actually feels like to be alone in a building like that, because I don't think people who haven't done it really understand. It's not fear at first. It's more like a heightened awareness that takes a little while to settle down, like how your eyes adjust to darkness. You notice more than you normally would, the sound of your own footsteps, the specific quality of silence in a large, empty room, the way the exit signs cast their green light into corners that nothing else reaches, the way a building that's meant for groups of people has a different atmosphere when it's only you. It's not threatening. It's just present. The building is present with you in a way it isn't when it's full of people. The first few nights were entirely uneventful. I developed my own version of the checklist routine. Slightly different from Terry's, I started with the restrooms because I hated them and wanted them done, then did the lobby, then the concession area, then worked my way back through the auditoriums. 1 through 3. I gave 4 exactly the attention it deserved, which was none. I walked past it, didn't look at it, didn't think about it much. Closed means closed. It wasn't my problem. The building I started to know, the way all-night workers learn the buildings they occupy. The carpet in the main hallway had a specific dampness on rainy nights. Not wet, but soft underfoot, in a way that felt slightly wrong, like pressure on a bruise. The fluorescent in the hallway outside Auditorium 2 flickered for about 4 seconds every 20 minutes or so, a cycle I eventually memorized without meaning to. The HVAC in the main auditorium made a higher-pitched sound when the outside temperature dropped below 40, which in March it did regularly. The concession counter had a cold spot to the left of the popcorn machine where a wall-mounted air vent blew directly down. And on cold nights, I learned to avoid standing there too long. Normal building stuff, the kind of things you catalog without deciding to, that become part of the texture of your nights. What I'm saying is, I was comfortable there by the end of the first week, as comfortable as you get with a place like that. It was on my 6th or 7th solo night, early April by then, though the nights were still cold, that I noticed the first thing. I was in the supply closet getting a replacement trash bag, and I looked up at the shelf above the door where Dale kept a record of supplies used. This was a thing Meridian apparently required for billing purposes. You were supposed to mark off what you used each night on a tally sheet that hung on a clipboard near the entrance of the supply closet. Trash bags, paper towels, mop heads, chemicals, that kind of thing. It went to a ledger, and the ledger went to whoever accounted for such things. I was looking at the tally sheet to mark my trash bag, and I noticed the numbers. Specifically, I noticed that the tally for large, black trash bags showed more had been used than I had used. I counted 4 marked for the previous Sunday night, my last solo shift, and I had used 3. I knew because I was precise about it. 1 per auditorium, 3 auditoriums. I didn't pull a 4th unless one tore, and Sunday had been uneventful. I looked at it for a moment, then I thought, maybe Terry came in for a reason, or maybe there's a day person who does spot cleaning sometimes, maybe Carol. I wasn't sure of the full picture of who used the building and when. I marked my 3 bags, put the clipboard back, and went to work. But I thought about the 4 bags later, around 3 in the morning, when the building was at its most settled and quiet, and the only thing to do was keep moving. I thought about it and added it to a small mental folder I didn't really know I was keeping, a folder for things that were slightly off. The folder got its second item about a week later. I was finishing up Auditorium 1 on a Tuesday night. It was after 2. I had been working for about 4 hours, and I was ready to be done, tired in the bone-deep way that overnight work creates, where your body knows something is wrong, even when your shift is almost over. I had replaced the trash liner at the back of the house, swept the main aisle, spot cleaned a couple of seat backs that had something sticky on them. I was doing a final walkthrough before I moved on, the way Dale's checklist instructed, just making sure nothing was missed. The main auditorium had a different feel from the smaller ones. It was bigger, obviously, but it was also older, and the plaster work on the high ceiling, the ornate border with its faded painted figures, Greek-looking, women in flowing robes and men with instruments, gave it a weight that the newer rooms didn't have. The screen itself was large and gray in the dark, lit only by the exit signs and whatever dim ambient light came through the gaps in the curtains flanking it. The rows of seats went back a long way. 45 rows of maybe 25 seats each. I never counted exactly. I was near the back when I heard it. A sound. Low, rhythmic. Like breathing, I stopped. The sound continued for 2 or 3 seconds, then stopped, then started again. I stood very still. I've read enough about this kind of thing. Being alone, in buildings at night, hearing things to know that the first instinct is always to assign meaning before you've assessed the situation. My heart rate went up, that's true, but I stayed still and I listened. It was the HVAC, I was almost certain. The system had a cycling quality to it, and the duct nearest the back of the auditorium was overhead and slightly behind where I was standing. And when the system shifted between cycles, it sometimes made a low, repetitive sound that was more felt than heard, a kind of pressure change. I was almost certain. I went to the back wall and I looked up at the vent. The vent was closed, or rather, the slats were angled downward, which was how they always were. I stood there for a minute and the sound didn't repeat. Probably the HVAC. The building was old. Old buildings make sounds. I finished my walkthrough and moved on. The thing about the locked door was that I hadn't really put it together until the night I found it on my checklist. This was about 3 weeks into working alone. I came in one Sunday night, a cold, wet night, rain coming down steadily, and the parking lot full of puddles that reflected the neon from the gas station across the street, and found that my checklist had been updated, printed fresh, laminated fresh, and left on top of the supply cart. The new checklist was identical to the old one in most ways, but there was a new item on it, handwritten in blue pen in the margin next to the auditorium section. Also check exterior of all equipment doors and maintenance access panels. Report any damage to Dale. This was not alarming in itself. It was a normal maintenance addendum. Buildings sometimes need this kind of audit. But someone had circled in red pen on the paper beside the checklist, not on the checklist itself, but on a notepad page underneath it, the number 4. Just the number, a 4. In red pen, circled. I looked at it for a while. I picked up the notepad and turned it over, looked at the back, found nothing. The page hadn't been torn from anything. It was just sitting there. I put it aside and started my shift. Around 1:30 in the morning, and I was in the back hallway, auditoriums 3 and 4 on my left, the utility corridor on my right. I was replacing the supply cart with a freshly loaded one that I'd staged near the closet. The hallway was quiet. The flickering light above 2 wasn't flickering that night. It had gone entirely out, which I noted to report to Dale. Without it, the hallway was darker than usual, lit only by the exit signs at either end. I looked at door 4. It was just a door. Tarnished brass knob, paper sign. No different from how it always was. I don't know exactly what made me try it. The 4 on the notepad, maybe. Some combination of the dark hallway and the rain outside, and being alone in that building for 3 weeks, with the door always there at the edge of my awareness. I put my hand on the knob and turned it gently. It didn't move. Locked, as expected. I gave it a very slight push, the kind that isn't really pushing, just pressure, to confirm. It was solid. I stood there for a moment. Then, from the other side of the door, there was a sound. I want to describe this accurately because I've thought about it many times, and I want to get it right. It was not a dramatic sound. It was not a voice or a scream or footsteps. It was more like settling, the sound a building makes when its structure adjusts, like a tick or a creak. But denser than that, more like something with weight had shifted position somewhere in the room beyond. Then nothing. I stepped back from the door. My heart was going. I stood in the hallway and looked at the door and waited. But there was nothing more. I thought, old building? Old building shift. The rain outside, the temperature change, wood expands, contracts. Pipes move in the walls. I went back to work. I finished the night. I drove home in the rain, but I added the settling sound to the mental folder. And now the folder had a little weight to it. I called Terry the next day. He had given me his number during orientation, Dale's instruction in case of building issues, and I had his contact saved as Terry Theater in my phone. I called around noon when I figured he'd be up. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding alert, like he'd been up for a while. "Hey, it's Marcus," I said. "That's my name. Marcus Webb. I don't think I've said that yet. I worked the training shifts with you a few weeks back." "Yeah, I know," he said. "What's up?" "Question about 4?" I said. A pause. Not a long one. Maybe 2 seconds. "What about it?" "I was near the door last night and I heard something inside. Like a settling sound, probably nothing, but I wanted to check. Is there any mechanical equipment in there? Boiler, something like that? Because if something's running in there, it might explain." "Talk to Dale about the equipment," Terry said. His voice was level, not unkind, just decisive. "Sure," I said. "I just thought since you've been there longer, you might know the building." "Talk to Dale," he said again. Another pause. Then he said, "You okay?" The question was simple, but the way he asked it wasn't simple. It had something in it, not concern exactly, but awareness, like he was asking something more specific than the words. "Yeah," I said, "just trying to understand the building." "All right," he said, "that's probably smart. Understanding the building." He said it in a way that I parsed several times later. Not sarcastically, not warmly, just noting it, like an observation. We hung up. I called Dale. He picked up immediately, which surprised me. Dale always seemed like a man who had many things competing for his attention. But he answered on the 1st ring. "Marcus," he said, which meant he had my number saved, which was logical. I described the sound. I kept it simple near the door to 4, heard a settling noise, wanted to know if there was mechanical equipment inside that might explain it. "Old building," Dale said. "It shifts." "That's what I figured," I said. "Just wanted to check." "Nothing in that room." he said. Nothing running, nothing active. It's under renovation. If you hear anything weird in the building generally, just report it on the sheet, and I'll have someone look at it. Sure, I said. One other thing, the tally for trash bags was off a few weeks ago. Showed 4 used on a Sunday, but I only used 3. Silence. Not long. 3 seconds, maybe. Could be a count error from the day before, he said. Could be Carol did a quick clean after a matinee. Don't worry about the count. Just mark what you use. Got it, I said. Thanks, Dale. Yep, he said, and hung up. I sat in my apartment for a while after that. I ate a bowl of cereal. I was still on an overnight sleep schedule, even on my off days. And I looked out the window at the street, which was bright and ordinary. Cars going by, a dog being walked, a guy jogging in a bright jacket. There was nothing wrong. Old building, count error, plausible explanations. I was filling a folder with things that all had ordinary explanations. I went to sleep and I didn't dream about anything. I want to tell you about Carol because Carol is important and I haven't given her enough space yet. Carol Burrows was the daytime manager of the Orrton Rex. She was in her mid-60s, a small woman with short silver hair and reading glasses that she wore on a beaded chain around her neck. And she had the specific competence of someone who has managed the same place for a very long time. She knew where everything was, what was wrong with everything, how long each thing had been wrong, and what the plan was to fix it, even if the plan was essentially wait and see. She had been at the Rex for nearly 20 years. She told me this the first time I met her in person, which was early April, a weekday morning when I was leaving just as she was arriving. We overlapped in the parking lot. She was getting out of a red Subaru and I was getting into my Civic. She already knew who I was, Dale had told her apparently, and she said hello and asked how I was settling in. I said fine, getting used to the building. She nodded and said the building took some getting used to. Then she said, unprompted, if you ever have questions about the building systems, ask me. Dale's a contractor. He doesn't know the building as well as I do. Good to know, I said. I've got one, actually. The fluorescent in the hallway by Auditorium 2 is out, not flickering anymore, fully out. She noted this in a small notebook she produced from her cardigan pocket. Then she said, anything else? I thought about 4. I thought about the sound and the tally and the circled number on the notepad. Then I thought about Terry's voice. Talk to Dale, and something in that memory made me pause. Not right now, I said. She smiled. It was a normal smile, small, appropriate. Well, if anything comes up. She turned and went inside. I sat in my car for a minute before starting it. There was nothing wrong with that conversation. Nothing at all. I drove home. The thing about working overnight in the same building for weeks is that you start to notice patterns with the precision of someone who has no other sensory input for 8 hours. It's like how you can hear a specific sound in your apartment, a particular creak of the floor, a specific gurgle of the pipes that you'd never notice during the day, but at 2 a.m, you know the exact sequence of it and exactly when it's going to happen. I knew the Rex. I knew the ventilation cycle. I knew the fluorescent schedules. I knew the sound of the HVAC engaging in the main auditorium versus the smaller ones. I knew which row of seats in Auditorium 3 had one that reclined more than it should and would tip back with a click if you walked too close. I knew that the left bathroom stall in the women's restroom had a door that didn't hang right and needed a firm push to stay closed. I knew that the concession counter's glass top sweated in cold weather and needed 2 passes with the window cloth to clear it properly. I knew these things, which is why in the 3rd week of April, I knew something was different. I was in Auditorium 2 on a Monday night, early around 11:30. I'd only been in the building for about an hour. I was sweeping the main aisle, and I was going to do a pass along the rows before I collected and moved to the trash. Standard sequence. The auditorium held maybe 120 seats, arranged in the stadium layout of the 80s renovations, slightly raked, each row a little higher than the one before. I started at the front and worked back. And when I got to approximately the middle of the room, I noticed that 3 seats in row H had their armrests down. Not all the way down, angled down as if someone had rested their arms there. This was not dramatic. Seats get left in various positions. People adjust them, lean on them, use them in different ways, but the Rex had been closed since the previous Friday, and when I'd cleaned this room on Sunday night, the seats had all been up in the retracted position, which was their default. Today was Monday. The theater had been closed since Friday. I looked at the 3 seats, H-12, H-13, H-14, by the row markings on the armrests. They were in the middle of the row, roughly centered in the room. The armrests of the seats on either side were up. I stood in the aisle and thought about it. Then I thought about the time 11:30, meaning Carol had been there until roughly 6 or 7 and had presumably done a walkthrough before locking up. Maybe she'd sat down in here for some reason, checked the seats, whatever. Maybe the cleaning person they used between the weekend showings. I righted the armrests and continued sweeping, but I wrote it in a physical notebook I'd started keeping in my jacket pocket. I hadn't decided to start keeping a notebook, it just happened. One night, when I was thinking through the building's quirks, and I wanted to write something down, and I had a small spiral notebook from the store, and I wrote in it. After that, I kept it. Seats in H-12, 13, 14 in position. Monday, April 21st. Theater closed since Friday. That's all I wrote. Just the facts. The following week, I found something in the trash. This sounds mundane, but it was the kind of thing that, in context, was not mundane at all. I was replacing the liner in the trash can at the back of the main auditorium. The can near the door on the right side, which was the main house entry. This was a routine task. 3rd time that night, I'd replaced a liner somewhere, and I was tired and not really paying attention. I pulled the full liner, which was knotted from my previous night, out of the can, tied the new one in. Then I noticed that the liner I'd just pulled was heavy. This made me stop. I had emptied this can on Sunday night. On Sunday night, this can had been essentially empty, maybe a crumpled napkin, some stray popcorn from the residue that works its way into every surface in a movie theater, regardless of how often you clean. I had pulled a liner that weighed almost nothing, tied it, put it with the other trash. The liner I had just pulled weighed maybe 2 or 3 pounds. The theater had been closed Sunday night, all day Monday, all day Tuesday. It was now Tuesday night, my first night of the week, and I had found a weighted trash bag in a can I had emptied 48 hours ago. I set the bag down and I looked at it. It was knotted at the top, which meant someone had tied it. I had knotted the liner Sunday night, but my knot was on the outside of the bag I'd pulled the liner. The trash inside had gone down, and I'd knotted the original liner to dispose of it. The new liner had been put in clean and empty. What was in it was not something I'd left behind. I opened the knot. Inside, 2 paper cups, the large size from the concession stand, a popcorn bag, medium with residue, a candy box Twizzlers, a crumpled napkin, 1 plastic straw. Someone had been in this auditorium while the theater was closed. Someone had watched a movie, or at least sat in this auditorium eating concession food between Sunday night and Tuesday night. And someone had tied the trash inside a fresh liner. I put the bag aside and sat down in the nearest seat. I wasn't panicking. That's not quite the right word. I was doing the thing where you inventory the possible explanations very carefully. Because if you can find a good one, you can keep working and go home at 6 and sleep. Possible explanations? Carol had been in here. Some other staff member, a maintenance person, Dale. There was a showing I didn't know about, some private screening or event. I took out my notebook and wrote everything down. The weight of the bag, the contents, the date, the time. I wrote it precisely, then I went to find Carol's number in my phone contact. I'd gotten it from Dale's sheet at some point, and I looked at it. It was 11:45 at night. Carol wasn't going to answer at 11:45 on a Tuesday. I put the phone away. I kept working. The thing about Carol was that when I talked to her the next day, she was entirely calm. I called around noon. She answered right away. Also, like Dale, I was starting to notice this, that the people associated with the Rex tended to answer quickly, as if they were always available or always expecting calls. I described the trash bag. I kept my voice even factual, the way I'd written it in my notebook. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I had someone in for a private event Saturday evening. Sometimes the bags get put back in without being disposed of first. My apologies for the confusion. A private event on a night the theater was closed? We do occasional private rentals, she said, not advertised. Corporate things, family events. It doesn't happen often. And this was plausible. Theaters do private rentals. On Sunday we were closed. You said the event was Saturday, but I cleaned Sunday night and the bag was empty then. What I found was in a fresh liner from Sunday. Another pause, slightly longer. Then perhaps whoever cleaned up after the event was in on Sunday. I'd have to check the schedule. Who would I ask about that, just so I can keep track of when others are in the building during my hours? I'll make a note, she said. We'll try to communicate better when there are others in the building. I'd appreciate that, I said. Also, was anyone in the building Monday or Tuesday before my shift? Not to my knowledge, she said. Her voice was the same temperature all the way through even. Measured, not defensive, but not quite accommodating either. The voice of someone who is used to answering questions on their own terms. Okay, I said. Thanks, Carol. Of course, she said. Marcus, I appreciate how conscientious you are. That's genuinely helpful to us. I thanked her and hung up. I sat with that conversation for a long time. It had explained everything, every part of it was plausible. Private event, cleanup crew on Sunday, miscommunication noted for the future. But she hadn't answered my question about Monday and Tuesday. She'd said not to my knowledge, which wasn't the same as no. I didn't tell Dale about the trash bag. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because Carol had answered it. Maybe because I sensed that both of them occupied separate compartments of information about the Rex, and the compartments didn't overlap as much as they should. Dale knew the cleaning operation. Carol knew the building. Or that was how it was supposed to work. What I decided to do instead was start paying closer attention to the inventory. I began doing something I hadn't done before, taking a precise count every night of the trash bags remaining on the shelf. I wrote the number in my notebook. This sounds obsessive, but it was actually very simple. The box had a count printed on it. I could subtract what I'd used, I knew what the number should be. Any discrepancy would tell me something. April 28th, Sunday. 47 bags remaining. April 29th. Monday should be 44. I used 3 per night. Actual 42. 2 extra bags used. May 1st, Wednesday, should be 39. Another 3 from Tuesday. Actual 36. 3 extra bags from Tuesday. I sat with this for a while. I was absolutely certain of my own count. I used 3 bags, 1 per auditorium. I counted them out. I was precise about it. Someone was using trash bags on the nights I wasn't there, and the quantity suggested it wasn't just 1 bag, it was full cleaning quantities. 3 bags on Tuesday, 2 on Sunday. Someone was cleaning the building on the nights I wasn't there, or cleaning one part of the building on those nights. I looked at my notebook, looked at the numbers. 3 bags, 1 through 4, 4 auditoriums. I want to stop here and tell you about a conversation I had with a man named Henry, because it changes the shape of what comes after. Henry was a daytime usher at the Rex, one of only 2 people who worked the floor on weekends. He was in his 70s, originally from somewhere in the South. His accent still carried it, and he'd been at the Rex for 12 years. He was the kind of man who had a story for everything and told most of them whether or not you'd asked. I met him on a Saturday morning when I'd come back to the building in the daytime. For the first time, I'd left my notebook behind, and I couldn't stop thinking about it, which in retrospect tells you something about my mental state by then. I came in through the front, which was open, and found Henry at the concession counter, sorting candy boxes. He introduced himself with a handshake and the warmth of someone who genuinely liked meeting new people. We talked for a few minutes. The usual "so you're the night cleaner" conversation. He was friendly, easy, the kind of talkative that fills silences naturally, and at some point I said, 12 years here, you must know every corner of this place. He laughed. Every corner and then some. Old buildings got a lot of corners, including 4, I said, and I said it casually, like it was just part of the flow. Something shifted in Henry's expression. Not dramatically, a small adjustment, the way a face makes when it's deciding something. He kept smiling, but the smile was doing a different job than it had been a moment before. 4's been closed a long time, he said. How long? He considered the candy box in his hand. Milk duds. He set it in the case with the others. Before my time. Before your 12 years? That's right. He looked at me directly. His eyes were sharp. The kind that age makes sharper, rather than duller. You're curious about it? I work back there every night, I said. Hard not to be curious. He nodded slowly. I suppose it is. He straightened some boxes that didn't need straightening. Old theater's got history, you know what I mean by that? Not just long history, but weight. Things that happen that don't always stay where they happened. What happened in 4? He looked at me again. The smile was still there, but very faint now. Nothing I was told directly, he said. Nothing that anybody's told me. It's just a room that's been closed a long time, and some things stay closed because it's better for them to stay closed. He said this in a way that was neither dramatic nor dismissive. It was just a statement delivered in the even voice of someone who had made peace with something. Henry, I said carefully, has anyone on staff ever been in that room in your 12 years? He picked up another box of candy. Twizzlers. I noticed the brand and something moved in me. I wouldn't know, he said. I work days. But has anyone mentioned it to you and any of the night staff? Night staff come and go, he said. They don't stay long. He said this without emphasis, factually. Then he looked at me and said, with a gentleness that surprised me, "You seem like a solid young man. You work hard, you pay attention. Sometimes paying attention is good. Sometimes it's better to pay attention to other things and let the thing you can't fix stay where it is." I didn't say anything to that. He smiled, the full version now, and said, "Let me know if you need anything," and went back to the candy display. I found my notebook. I drove home. Night staff come and go. They don't stay long. I had been at the Rex for 2 months when I started hearing it consistently. Not every night. Roughly every third night, and not always at the same time. It was always from the direction of the back hallway, always in the window between about 1 and 3 in the morning. And it was always the same quality of sound, quiet, rhythmic, low, like something moving in an enclosed space, not footsteps which have a sharp definition. More like a shift of weight, a sustained pressure. I had told myself from the beginning that it was the HVAC. By May, I had stopped telling myself that. The HVAC made specific sounds at specific intervals, and I knew all of them. The sound I was hearing was not on those intervals, and it didn't have the mechanical quality of the system. It had the quality of something slower and less regular. I started timing it. In my notebook, sound at 1:47, duration approximately 4 minutes, stopped. Sound at 2:10, duration approximately 2 minutes. I was precise about this because precision felt like control, and control felt necessary. The sound always came from the direction of the back hallway, which put its source somewhere near auditoriums 3 or 4. On 2 separate nights, I stood in the hallway while the sound was happening, and it clarified. It was coming from 4. Not dramatically, not unmistakably. But the direction and distance were consistent, and when I stood close to the door, I could feel it, not hear it exactly, but feel a kind of vibration in the door itself, very faint, the way a door vibrates when there's bass sound in the room beyond. On one of these nights, I put my hand flat on the door and stood there for almost a minute. The vibration came and went 3 times while I stood there, then stopped. I wrote in my notebook, "Door has vibration consistent with interior movement, not mechanical quality, not HVAC." Then I stood in the hallway for a long time doing nothing. In mid-May, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I came in an hour early. My shift started at 10. I arrived at 8:45, parked in the lot, and went in through the front entrance, which was still open. The Rex stayed open until 9 on weekday evenings in summer. The last showing was just letting out. Maybe 30 people filtering through the lobby, getting their coats, talking quietly. A normal weeknight crowd, families, a few older couples, some teenagers. Carol was behind the concession counter, counting the till. She looked up when I came in, registered mild surprise. "You're early," she said. "Figured I'd take a look at the building with some life in it," I said. "If that's all right." "Of course," she said. "Help yourself." I walked through the lobby. I went down the hallway toward the auditoriums. 1, 2, 3. All had people still leaving. The staff helping them out, collecting remaining cups and bags. Henry was in the main auditorium doing a quick pass. He acknowledged me with a nod. I walked to the end of the hallway. The door to 4 was the same as always. Tarnished knob, paper sign. I stood a few feet from it. The building was loud in a relative way, people, voices, the sound of the other auditoriums emptying, normal closing time sounds. And then there was a moment, just a moment between the sounds. A gap. The way gaps happen when people stop talking simultaneously. A natural beat in the noise. And in that gap I heard, from behind the door to Auditorium 4, the clear and unmistakable sound of a seat folding. The specific sound of a theater seat flipping up on its spring. The sound I had heard hundreds of times in the other auditoriums when I cleaned them. Unique, mechanical, definite. I took a step toward the door. "Oh, careful there." It was one of the young ushers, a girl, 18, 19, coming down the hallway with a garbage bag. She'd appeared from Auditorium 3. "The floor's wet over there? Someone spilled?" I looked down. The carpet in front of the door was not wet. The floor was dry. The girl walked past me and headed up the hallway without looking back. I looked at the door. The building noise had risen again. People talking, the clink of equipment. The moment was gone. I went and found Carol, and I told her about the seat sound. She looked at me over the counter with the reading glasses on the chain. She said, 4? Yes. "Nothing in there," she said. "It's an old building. Sound travels through walls and floors in strange ways in these old structures. Something from 3 could easily sound like it came from 4. It was very specific," I said, "the sound of a seat spring. I've been cleaning those auditoriums for 2 months. "I know," she said, "and I appreciate that. I'll have Dale check the room." "Can I be there when he does?" A pause, small, controlled. "That's not really something we'd ask a cleaning contractor to." "I'm not asking in a professional capacity," I said. "I'm just curious. I've been hearing things from that room. I'd like to understand it." Carol looked at me for a long moment. Her face was not unkind. It was the face of someone who has had a version of this conversation before, maybe more than once, and who has arrived at a practiced way of handling it. "Marcus," she said, "I hear you. I do. Old buildings are strange. Yours isn't the first job like this where someone gets curious about the quirks. What I can tell you is that room is secured. There's nothing in it that should be making any noise. And the right thing to do is let us handle it through the appropriate channels." She paused again. "If you're not comfortable working in the building, I understand, and I'm comfortable," I said quickly, because I needed this job. That was still true. I just wanted to report it. "And I appreciate that," she said warmly. "I'll have Dale look." I went and got my cart and started my shift. Dale did not look. Or if he did, he didn't tell me anything about it. The security logs. I found out about the security logs by accident in the second week of June. The Rex had a basic security system, door sensors, a couple of cameras in the lobby and parking lot. Nothing internal except the lobby. The system panel was in a small alcove near the manager's office, behind a locked cover that required a key I didn't have. I had no reason to have it. The system wasn't part of my job, but one night the panel cover was open, just open. The little hinged metal cover that protected the keypad and the small screen hanging ajar on its hinge. I noticed it when I was cleaning the concession area, which brought me close to the alcove. I stopped, looked at it, and then because I was who I was becoming by then, I looked at the screen. The screen showed a log, recent access events, timestamps, door codes, sensor readings. It was a small screen and some of the text was small, but I could read the entries for the last several days. What I was looking for, though I hadn't articulated it to myself until that moment, was whether anyone had entered the building on nights I wasn't working. Sunday, June 1st, building access at 2314, my arrival. Departure 5:47, my departure. Monday, June 2nd. Building access at 22:58. Departure at 5:51. Tuesday, June 3rd. Building access at 23:09. Departure at 5:39. Wednesday, June 4th. I was off. Thursday, 5th. Building access at 2:17. Departure at 4:33. Thursday night was not one of my nights. I read that entry 3 times, 2:17 to 4:33. Someone had entered the building at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, a night I wasn't there, and left at 4:30. I took out my phone and photographed the screen. The photo came out small but readable. Then I carefully pushed the panel cover back to how I'd found it, partly open, as if the latch hadn't caught properly. I went and finished the lobby. The entry for Thursday showed a code. Every access entry had an access code, a 4-digit number that corresponded to a key holder. My code was 4471, assigned by Dale. The Thursday entry showed code 1000. I didn't know what 1000 corresponded to, but I took the photo and I knew what I'd seen. I started researching the Rex. I don't have a dramatic way to frame this. I just started digging through whatever was available online, the town newspaper's archives, which went back to the 90s in a digital form that was partially searchable. Local history forums, a county historical society website that hadn't been updated since 2014. I did this on my days off in the evenings before my overnight shifts, whenever I had time. What I found, piece by piece, was not a story. It was more like the suggestion of a story, edges of something. The Rex had opened in 1948 and operated continuously as a single-screen theater until 1987, when the expansion added the 3 smaller auditoriums. The addition was funded by a local investor. The name was mentioned in a newspaper feature from the time a man named Raymond Creel, who had owned several properties in Orrton and apparently had an interest in preserving the theater rather than seeing it demolished or converted. The expansion created auditoriums 2, 3, and 4. 4 was operational. I found a reference to it in a brief 1989 review of the Rex's layout in the county paper, which mentioned the new Auditorium 4, which seats approximately 90 and has a slightly more intimate atmosphere than the others. After 1989, I found no further references to Auditorium 4. Nothing. Not a closing announcement, not a renovation notice, not a mention in any article about the theater from 1990 onward. The Rex was mentioned occasionally in the county paper and anniversary feature, a note about its role in the community, a short piece when Carroll took over management in 2001. And in all of these, the theater was described as having 3 screens or 3 auditoriums, not 4, as if 4 had never existed. I looked up Raymond Creel. He had died in 1993, age 64. The obituary was sparse. Survived by 2 adult children, lifelong resident of Orrton County, businessman and civic supporter. Contributions to the Orrton Rex Theater were mentioned. Nothing unusual. But then I found something in the back pages of a 1990 newspaper archive, a police report summary, the kind that small-town papers used to run as a block of text property disputes, noise violations, that kind of thing. It was a list of incidents for a single week in October 1990, and one of them read, "Police responded to a disturbance call at 147 Main Street, Orrton Rex Theater, at approximately 2:30 a.m. on Tuesday. Officers found no evidence of forced entry, and the building was secured. Management notified. 1 item, 1 incident, no follow-up. 147 Main Street was the Rex. October 1990. 1 year after Auditorium 4 had been described as operational, I wrote the date in my notebook. I added the access code 100 to the page. I sat in my apartment and looked at what I'd assembled. It wasn't a conclusion, it wasn't an answer. It was a shape in the dark that I was slowly becoming able to see the outline of. I decided to do something in late June that I knew was probably not wise. I want to be clear about the decision making. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't the person in the horror movie who goes into the basement alone because they heard a sound. I had spent months paying attention, taking notes, asking careful questions, and getting careful non-answers. I had watched the inventory numbers, tracked the security logs, listened to the sounds, asked Carol and Dale and Terry about each piece, and received plausible but incomplete answers that were just plausible enough to prevent me from quitting and just incomplete enough to prevent me from feeling settled. What I decided to do was simple. I was going to look under the door. The gap between the bottom of the door to Auditorium 4 and the carpet beneath it was maybe a 1/4 inch. Not a lot, but potentially enough to see if there was light inside or anything else. I chose a Wednesday night in late June because Wednesday was the quietest night. The theater had a matinee that day, but nothing in the evening. I arrived at my usual time and worked through the building at a normal pace, doing everything correctly, not rushing. I got to the back hallway around 1:30 in the morning, which was normal. I worked through Auditorium 3. I replaced the liner, swept, spot checked. Then I came back into the hallway. I knelt down in front of the door to Auditorium 4. The gap was real. About a 1/4 inch, maybe a little more, where the door didn't quite meet the threshold. This was consistent with old buildings where things settle and doors become imprecise in their frames over time. I lowered myself down and looked under the door. Darkness. Not a complete darkness. There was a faint ambient quality to it. The kind of near black that you find in rooms with exit signs, which every auditorium has on both sides of the screen. It took my eyes a moment to adjust to even that degree. What I could see? The underside of auditorium seats, the front row, just barely, the carpet, the lower part of a wall, the green glow from an exit sign, far away, deep in the room, and footprints. The carpet in Auditorium 4. What I could see of it from this angle showed footprints, not wet ones, not tracked in mud, just the compression of carpet that shows where feet have recently been. Fresh paths in the pile, as clear to a trained eye as any track in soft ground. The paths led down the main aisle. I couldn't see where they led because my angle only showed me the front of the room. But they were there, and they were not the random compression you get from years of traffic. They were organized, directional, recent. I straightened up. My knees ached from the floor. I stood in the hallway and breathed steadily. Then I tried the doorknob. Locked, as always. But here's the thing I want to be precise about. Here's the thing that I have thought about on every rainy night since then, in every long hallway, every time I hear a building settle. When I turned the knob, it moved slightly before it stopped. Not the immediate, complete resistance of a deadbolt. A small, partial rotation, maybe 15 degrees before it caught. This kind of partial rotation happens in 2 types of locks. One, a lock that is locked from the outside by key. 2, a privacy lock or thumb turn, which is locked from the inside. A key-locked door, when you turn the knob from outside, gives immediate full resistance, no rotation at all. The door to Auditorium 4 gave me 15 degrees of rotation before it stopped. Someone or something had locked the door from inside. I stood there with my hand on the knob for a long moment. Then I let go, walked up the hallway, collected my cart, finished my shift. I cleaned Auditorium 1. I cleaned the lobby again, and I replaced the mop head when it needed replacing. I checked everything on my list. I drove home at 6:15. I sat in my car in my parking lot for 45 minutes before I went inside. I need to tell you something about the state I was in by this point, which was late June 2019. I want to be honest about it because I think it matters for understanding what came next. I was not sleeping well, which is ironic, given that poor sleep was the occupational hazard of the job regardless. But beyond the overnight schedule, I was having difficulty with the actual quality of sleep I was getting. I'd lie down in the afternoon and sleep fine for 3 or 4 hours. Then wake up and lie there in the gray apartment light with the specific clarity of someone who has been awake too long and is thinking about something in circles. I was thinking about the door. Not in a dramatic way, not with fear exactly. More with the dogged, gnawing quality of an unresolved problem that you can't stop turning over. The 15-degree rotation, the footprints, the inventory numbers, the access code 100. Oh. The 1990 police report, Henry saying things that happened that don't always stay where they happened. Terry saying it's not my job to ask about it. I was also aware that I was starting to behave differently in the building. Nothing drastic, but I was moving more slowly in the back hallway, listening more, pausing near the door to for in a way that I recognized was probably not useful and might even be making things worse, because the more attention I gave it, the more I'd notice. And the more I noticed, the less comfortable I'd be. I was also spending money I didn't really have on snacks from a convenience store that I'd eat at my car before my shift started, which was how I knew my anxiety had a physical component. I always ate when I was anxious. It was a pattern that went back to college. I wasn't in crisis. I want to be clear. I was an adult person with a job and a notebook and a developing picture of something strange. And I was keeping it together well enough to work and pay rent and function. But I was not okay in the way that I'd been okay at the beginning, when the building was just a building and the job was just a job. And in this state, tired, anxious, turning things over, I made the decision to talk to somebody who actually knew the full history of the Rex. Somebody other than Carol or Dale. It took me a few weeks to find the right person, and I found him through the County Historical Society website I'd seen before. The website had a contact form, and I sent a message asking generally about the history of the Orrton Rex Theater, framing it as casual historical interest. I got a response 10 days later from a man named Gerald Finch, who said he'd been a member of the Historical Society for 30 years and had compiled an archive on Orrton's commercial buildings. He said he'd be happy to talk. We met at a diner in Orrton on a Sunday afternoon in late July, my day off. Gerald was in his mid-70s, retired, with the organized mind of someone who has spent decades caring about specific, documented facts. He arrived with an accordion folder that he set on the table between us like a briefcase. I told him I was working at the Rex and had gotten curious about its history. I kept it general at first. He told me about the 1948 opening, the renovation, the Creel investment things I mostly knew. I let him tell them because sometimes people get to important things through the familiar ones. Then I said, "What happened to Auditorium 4? He looked at his coffee. He wrapped his hands around the mug. "That's a specific question," he said. I clean the building at night, I said. I have been curious. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive thinking. There was a difference, and I'd learned to feel it. The fourth auditorium was opened in 1989 as part of the expansion, he said. It operated for about a year. And then? He looked at me, and there was an incident in the fall of 1990. What kind of incident? He opened his accordion folder and removed a photocopied newspaper page. He set it on the table and pushed it toward me. It was from the Orrton Courier, November 1990. The story was on the third page, not the front. Local news. The headline was, "Theater Incident Under Investigation. Auditorium to Remain Closed." I read it. The article was brief and carefully worded in the way that small-town journalism can be when it's managing community response. It said that an unspecified incident in Auditorium 4 of the Orrton Rex had prompted an investigation by local authorities and the temporary closure of the auditorium pending review. It quoted the theater's manager at the time, not Carol, a man named Huff, saying that the safety of patrons was paramount and that the auditorium would remain closed until all questions were resolved. It did not say what the incident was. What was the incident? I asked. That's the part, Gerald said carefully, that is not well documented. He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug again. What I have is partial. Accounts from people who were here then, oral history, that kind of thing. Nothing official. What do the accounts say? He looked at me steadily. A man was found in the auditorium, he said. A man who was not supposed to be there. Not a patron, not staff. He was found in a seat in the middle of the auditorium and the doors were locked. Both doors? The entry doors, yes, from the inside, which meant he had locked himself in at some point during the previous night. Nobody was certain when. Was he alive? Gerald set his coffee down. He was alive, he said. He was alive, and he was apparently not well in various senses. He was taken to a hospital in Columbus. I don't have records of what happened to him afterward. Who was he? A local man. He'd lived in Orrton his whole life. Gerald paused. He'd worked at the theater, years before in the 80s, early on, as a projectionist. The words sat on the table between us. The auditorium never reopened, Gerald said. Mr. Creel, the investor, instructed the management to keep it closed. He died 3 years later, but by then the instruction had become policy, and the subsequent management, Ms. Burroughs, has maintained it. Why? I asked. If it was one incident, one person, why keep it closed for 30 years? Gerald looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not evasion, not quite honesty, something between. There was a belief, he said slowly, that the man had been in there more than once, that the locked doors were not a one-time thing, that before he was found, maybe for months, before someone had been using that auditorium at night. Using it how? He shook his head, very slightly. That's what I don't know. What I've heard from people who aren't always reliable sources is that the room was clean. Always found clean in the morning, even when it hadn't been used in days, and the doors were always locked from inside. He looked at me carefully. And after the man was removed, the management at the time reported that the same thing continued. The diner around us was full of lunch noise conversations. A baby crying somewhere near the door. The sound of the kitchen. I became aware of all of it at once. Continued, I said. The room being found clean, he said, the locked doors, for a while. Then it seemed to stop, or they stopped paying attention to it. Kept the room closed, kept it quiet. He picked up his coffee. The story locally is that the man, the projectionist, did something to the room, or in the room, depending on who you ask. Nobody agrees on what. What was his name? Gerald hesitated one final time. Evers, he said. Paul Evers. He finished his coffee. We talked for another 20 minutes about other things. General history of the town, the building's architecture. He was kind and informative, and I was barely listening because the name Paul Evers was sitting in the front of my mind like a stone in shallow water. I thanked him and paid for his coffee. He gave me a business card and told me to call if I had other questions. I drove back to Columbus. Paul Evers had a limited digital presence, which was expected for someone of that age and era, but he had some. He died in 2011, age 71. He'd lived in Orrton his whole life, as Gerald said. He had worked at the Rex. I found his name in a 1979 newspaper photo caption describing the theater staff at some anniversary event. He was in the back row, a tall, lean man with glasses, identified as head projectionist. I found one other thing. A letter to the editor in the Orrton Courier, dated September 1990, just before the incident Gerald had described. The letter was short, unsigned, but had been written by someone who the editor's note described as a concerned local resident. The letter expressed vague concerns about activities at the Rex and asked the management to address what is plainly apparent to those of us who live and work nearby. The editor's response below the letter was equally vague, simply noting that the theater management had been contacted. Activities at the Rex, September 1990. 2 months before Paul Evers was found in the locked auditorium. I sat with my notebook open, and I looked at what I had assembled. It was not, even now, a complete picture. It was still outlines and suggestions, but the outlines were beginning to connect. A man had used Auditorium 4 in ways nobody understood for months, locking himself in from the inside. The room had been found clean each morning. He was removed. The room stayed closed. And then, according to Gerald, it continued, at least for a while. It was now 2019. 29 years later. The inventory numbers, the footprints, the seat sound, the 15-degree rotation of the knob. Someone was still cleaning the room. Someone was still locking the door from the inside. I started watching the building from the outside. This sounds more dramatic than it was. I would arrive early, park across the street, or in the gas station lot, and watch. I did this for 3 nights before I saw anything. On the 3rd night, a Monday in early August, I was parked in the gas station lot at 9:45, watching the Rex's rear parking lot. My shift started at 10. There was one other car in the lot, Carol's Subaru, which I recognized, and which was usually there when she was doing end-of-day paperwork. At 9:52, Carol came out of the rear entrance. I watched her lock the door with her key. She got in her car. She drove away. The parking lot was empty. At 9:57, I drove around the block and came at the lot from the other direction, so that I was pulling in from the east. I parked and looked at the building. No lights, except the dim timer-controlled lighting visible through the lobby windows. I went in through the rear at 10. The building was dark except for the timer lights and the exit signs. I did my usual routine. At 1:12 in the morning, I was in the main auditorium finishing my sweep. I heard the door, not the door to 4. The rear entrance, the specific sound of the rear door's push bar being activated, the mechanism clicking over, the door swinging. I had used that door enough times to know its exact sound. I stopped. I stood very still in the main auditorium in the dark. with the sound of the exit sign's faint electrical hum, and the ventilation system and nothing else. Footsteps. Quiet footsteps. On the lobby carpet. Moving with a purpose that was neither hurried nor casual even. Controlled. The footsteps of someone who knew exactly where they were going. They went down the main hallway toward the back. I heard them for 15-20 seconds. Then I didn't hear them. I stood in the main auditorium for what felt like a long time. Then I walked up the main aisle, out the auditorium door, into the lobby. The lobby was empty. I went to the rear door and opened it. The parking lot was empty. My Civic was the only car there. I went back inside. I went down the hallway to the back. The hallway was empty. Auditorium 1, 2, 3, all dark, all as I'd left them. The door to 4 was closed. I stood in the hallway and listened. Very faint, very far behind the door. The sound I'd been cataloging for months. The low rhythmic quality, the not quite mechanical, not quite human thing. I put my hand on the knob. Locked. The 15-degree rotation from the inside. I took my hand off the knob. I went back to work. I finished the night. I marked my supplies. I left the building at 6:03. I did not call Dale. I did not call Carol. I sat in my car for a while, and then I drove home. And then I lay in my bed in the August morning light with the blinds down, and I thought very carefully about what my choices were. The choices as I saw them were 3. 1. Quit. Quit the job, walk away, not think about it anymore. The practical problem with this was that I still needed the money. 2 months in, I'd caught up on rent. I had a small cushion. If I quit now, I'd be behind within 6 weeks. That was a real and non-dramatic constraint. 2. Report it, call the police, tell them someone is entering the building at night. The problems with this were several. First, if Carol or Dale were involved, if they knew about whoever was using the building and were covering for it, then involving police might cost me the job anyway, without answering any questions. Second, the police response to I heard footsteps in a building I was working in alone at 1 a.m. from a night cleaning contractor was probably going to be limited. Third, I had no firm evidence of any crime. Unusual inventory numbers and a door that locked from the inside were not police matters. 3. Find out. I chose 3, though I didn't arrive at it cleanly. I arrived at it the way you arrive at the decision to do something you've known for a while you were going to do, not with resolution, but with resignation. The recognition that the other options had already been eliminated. I was going to get into Auditorium 4. Getting into a room that's locked from the inside when you don't have a key is not as straightforward as it sounds. The knob was a privacy lock. A thumb turn on the inside, a keyhole on the outside. These locks are not difficult to pick if you know how. I didn't know how. What I did know was that the building had a projection booth. The projection booth at the Rex was accessed from the lobby level via a narrow staircase behind the wall near the manager's office. The booth ran across the back of the building above the rear of all 4 auditoriums. There were projection ports in the booth, facing each auditorium, the openings through which the projectors threw their light onto the screens. I had been given a key to the booth for bulb access. I had never used it. But the booth would have a port facing Auditorium 4. And if the port was large enough, or if there was another opening, I might be able to see inside. I want to be careful about how I frame this. I was not planning to break in. I was planning to observe This is a distinction that matters to me even if it doesn't resolve anything about the night that followed. I chose a Tuesday in mid-August. I worked through my regular routine until 2 in the morning, which by then was when the building was most consistently quiet. Then I went to the lobby, found the narrow staircase, and used the key. The projection booth was long and narrow, running the full width of the building. The ceiling was low, maybe 6.5 feet. There were 4 projection stations, 1 per auditorium, each with a heavy older projector bolted to a stand. The projectors for 1, 2, and 3 were relatively modern, probably replaced in the last decade. The station facing 4 had an older machine, much older. One of those big mechanical things with the dual platters that cinema projectionists used in the 70s and 80s. It was still there, still bolted, but unplugged, its cord coiled beside the stand. The projection port for 4 was smaller than the others. All 4 ports had a glass window fitted into them, a standard feature to reduce noise transmission. The windows for 1, 2, and 3 had been updated at some point. Clear glass hinged open for maintenance. The window for 4 was different. It was the same glass, the same frosted edge reinforced glass, but it had been painted over from the booth side. A thick coat of dark gray paint, the kind used on walls, applied with a brush in strokes you could still see, applied to block the view. I looked at this for a long time. Then I did something I'm not proud of, and I'm not going to pretend I had an airtight justification for. I took the key from my ring, the small one that Dale had told me was for the projection booth generally, and I tried it in the access door that I found on the side of the projection station facing 4. The access door was small, panel-sized, the kind used for equipment maintenance. There was no reason for me to have a key for it, but it fit. The lock turned. The door swung inward. Beyond it was darkness, and I was looking at the inside of the auditorium from above, from the projection booth's perspective, from perhaps 20 feet above the floor at the back of the house. I took out my phone and used the flashlight. The auditorium had 90 seats, arranged in 12 rows. The seats were the same brownish maroon as the ones in the other auditoriums, the same vintage, the same wear. Most of them were empty. Several in the middle of the room, roughly the same middle section, rows F through J. Seats 10 through 16 showed the compression of use. The specific way seats look when they've been sat in. Not badly worn, not grimy, just used. Recently and regularly used. The floor between those rows was clean. Cleaner than the floor elsewhere in the room, in fact, freshly swept. The carpet fibers upright in the way they only are when they've been recently vacuumed or swept. The screen was dark, gray fabric, undamaged, hung properly. The room was empty. There was no one in it. There was on the seat at the aisle end of row H, the same row I had noted months ago in Auditorium 2, though this detail struck me later, a folded piece of white cloth. Not a napkin, not a rag, a cloth, folded neatly, placed on the seat, with the precision of someone who places things carefully. I moved the flashlight around the rest of the room. I checked the walls, the corners, the space around the screen, empty. No one was there. But the room was maintained. The floor swept, the seats used but not trashed. A cloth folded on a seat in the middle of the house. The way a room looks when someone lives in it. The way a room looks when someone comes back to it. I stared at the folded cloth for a long time. Then I pulled the access door closed, locked it, and went back down the booth stairs. I stood in the lobby for a while. The clock on the concession counter said 2:47. I went back to work. What came next happened over the following 3 weeks. And I want to be very careful about how I tell this part because the events are precise, but my memory of them carries the specific distortion of that time, the exhaustion, the anxiety, the way prolonged unease starts to affect your perception. The first week after the projection booth was almost entirely normal. I cleaned, I marked my inventory, I noted nothing extraordinary. The sounds from 4 were present on their usual rhythm once or twice a night, on the nights I was in the building. The inventory numbers showed the pattern they'd shown for months. Nothing new. The second week, I arrived on a Monday to find Carol still in the building. This was unusual. She was typically gone before I arrived. On this night, she was in the manager's office, the door open, and she came out when she heard me in the lobby. "Marcus," she said. "Good, I wanted to catch you." "Everything all right?" I asked. "Perfectly," she said. "I just wanted to let you know we'll be having some work done in the building over the next few weeks. Equipment inspection, some updating of the electrical in the booth. There may be some additional personnel in the building during overnight hours." I looked at her. "Who?" "A contractor," she said. "Not associated with Meridian. They prefer to work at night because they don't want to disrupt our daytime operations." "What nights?" "Varies," she said. "They'll have access. I wanted you to know so you weren't startled." "Will they be in the auditoriums?" "Primarily the booth," she said. "Possibly the equipment rooms." "4?" I said. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A very small rearrangement like furniture in a room you can't quite see into. "Possibly," she said. "That's part of what they're assessing." "I'd like to know when they're in the building," I said, "if it's during my shift." "Of course," she said warmly. "That's completely reasonable." She picked up her bag from the counter. "I'll make sure they check in with you." Nobody ever checked in with me. Over the next 2 weeks, on 3 separate nights, I arrived at the building and found evidence that someone had been there. Not dramatic evidence, subtle things. A light left on that I hadn't left on in the utility corridor. A supply cart in a slightly different position than where I'd left it. The paper sign on the door for the one in the plastic tape that had gone yellow had been reaffixed with fresh, clear tape. Not replaced, just reaffixed, pressed down neatly. Someone had touched the sign. Someone had made sure it was secure. On the third of these nights, I found something on the supply cart that I hadn't put there. A key, small, brass, old-looking, not on a ring, not labeled, just sitting on the top of the cart next to my notebook, which I kept on the cart when I was working. I picked it up. It was a door key, the standard type. It could have been for any number of things. I tried it in the lock of door 4. It fit. I stood with the key in the lock and I turned it. The lock turned. But the door didn't open. Even unlocked by key from the outside, the door didn't open, and because the thumb turn on the inside was still engaged. I turned the key back, locked it again, took the key out. I stood in the hallway with the key in my hand for maybe 2 minutes. I put the key in my pocket and went back to work. I need to tell you about the last thing I saw in the projection booth, because I haven't told you yet. And it's the thing that changed the tenor of all of this for me. Changed it from strange to something I don't have a clean word for. It was a Thursday in late August. Not my regular shift night, but I had agreed to cover Terry's Wednesday and Thursday shifts because he was dealing with a family matter. So I was in the building on a night I wasn't usually there, I had been working for about 3 hours. It was nearly 2 in the morning. I was in the lobby, wiping down the glass concession counter. The sound was not from 4 this time. It was from above, from the projection booth. Not sounds I could identify specifically, just presence. The presence of something happening in the booth, transmitted through the ceiling. A low frequency, not a movement, but more like an ongoing state. The way a running engine is present, even when you can't hear it clearly. I thought about Carol's electrical contractor. But Carol's contractors had never appeared during my shifts. And if someone was in the booth, no one had told me. I went to the booth stairs. I unlocked the door. I went up. The booth was not empty. I want to describe this carefully and honestly. There was a man in the booth. He was seated in the folding chair at the projection station for Auditorium 4. The station with the old mechanical projector. The one with the dual platters. He was not doing anything. He was seated upright, hands in his lap, facing the painted-over glass of the projection port. He was old. Very old, I thought. Though the booth was lit only by the ambient light from the lamp above the door, and I couldn't see him clearly. White hair, or gray, thin. The posture of someone who spent a great deal of time sitting in this specific position. He wore a jacket, dark, slightly formal. The kind of jacket a person might have worn to work in 40 years ago. I stood at the top of the stairs. He didn't turn around. He sat facing the painted port glass, which was, of course, dark on both sides. "Hello," I said. He didn't respond. "I work here," I said. "Overnight cleaning? Are you the contractor Carol mentioned?" Nothing. I took a step into the booth. The floorboard beneath the carpet runner creaked. He still didn't turn. I could hear him breathing, low, steady, slow. "Sir," I said, "are you all right?" He turned. His face was the face of an old man, deeply lined, loose at the jaw, the skin of someone in their 80s. But his eyes were very clear, pale, steady, clear the way Gerald Finch's eyes had been clear. He looked at me with an expression that I have difficulty describing and have tried many times. It was not frightened. It was not angry. It was not even particularly surprised. It was more like the expression of someone who has been interrupted in a task that they have been doing for a very long time and has accepted the interruption but not welcomed it. He looked at me for what felt like a long moment but was probably 3 or 4 seconds. Then he looked back at the port glass. "Sir," I said again, and my voice was not entirely steady. "I need to ask you to leave the booth. It's not open to—" "I know," he said. His voice was low, the kind of low that comes from age and disuse. He said it simply, without elaboration. "You know," I said, "it's not open." He said, "I know." He was still looking at the port glass. "Then I need to ask you to—" "In a moment," he said. I stood there. This is the part I find most difficult to explain why I stood there. I should have gone and called someone. I should have told him firmly to leave, gone downstairs, called Carol, called the police, called anyone. But I stood there, and I watched him, because there was something in the room that prevented the kind of firm action I should have taken. Not fear exactly, though there was some of that. Something more like the feeling you get at the edge of something very old and very still. The feeling of not wanting to disturb something that has been in its state far longer than you have been in yours. He sat for another minute, maybe 2, looking at the dark painted glass. Then he stood. He was tall, taller than I'd expected, and he moved slowly but without difficulty. He picked up something from the desk beside the projector, a cloth, folded, white cloth, folded. He turned. He walked toward the stairs. He passed me at a distance of maybe 4 feet, close enough that I could smell his jacket. Old wool and something else, something faintly chemical, like developer fluid, and he went down the stairs without looking back. I heard him at the bottom. I heard the booth door open and close. I stood in the booth for a moment. Then I went to the projection station and I looked at the desk. On the desk beside the old projector was a logbook. It was not new. It was a composition book, the marbled black and white kind, worn at the corners, the cover slightly warped. I picked it up. Inside, in handwriting that was neat and precise, were dates and notes. The dates went back to 1989. Pages of them. Months and years of dates, each entry a brief notation in the same hand. November 12th, present, 2 hours. November 14th, present, 3 hours. November 20th, present, 1 hour. Left cloth. I turned to the last entry. It was from the current month. 2 weeks before this night, August 14th, present, 3 hours. Waiting. That was the last entry. I put the logbook down. I put it back exactly as I'd found it. I went downstairs. The building was empty. I walked through every room, lobby, hallways, all 4 auditoriums. The door to 4, I noticed, was locked again. The knob gave me the 15-degree rotation. And found no one. I finished my shift. I drove home. I called in sick the next night and the night after that. Dale called me on Friday and I said I had a stomach thing. He said, "Get better soon." He didn't sound concerned. I spent those 2 days in my apartment going over my notebook with the thoroughness of someone building something. I laid out everything in order, cross-referenced the dates, looked for the pattern. Here's what I had. Paul Evers had worked at the Rex as a projectionist from at least the late 70s through the 80s. He had been found in 1990 in Auditorium 4, locked inside, alone, not well in various senses, as Gerald had said. He had been removed and taken to Columbus. He had died in 2011 at age 71. The man in the projection booth was in his 80s. He could not be Paul Evers, unless the records I'd found were wrong about the death. Unless died in 2011 was wrong. I went back through my research. The death record was a brief notice in the county paper, the same paper that had covered the theater incident in 1990. The same paper that had described the theater as having 3 auditoriums for 30 years. The paper that was part of the town's apparatus of knowledge, which was also part of the town's apparatus of what did and didn't get known. I thought about Carol, about how quickly she answered her phone, about how she told me with warmth and steadiness that she'd make sure the contractor checked in with me, and then the contractor had never checked in with me. I thought about Terry. Night staff come and go. They don't stay long. I thought about Henry. Some things stay closed because it's better for them to stay closed. I thought about Gerald, who had told me more than Carol or Dale or Terry ever had, and who had also stopped at a specific point, a point that I now understood to be just before the part that didn't make sense. The logbook entries went back to 1989, 1 year before Evers was found, which meant Evers had been logging his visits to the room before anyone discovered him, before anyone else knew he was using it. And the logbook went all the way to 2 weeks ago. If Evers had died in 2011, someone else had been maintaining the logbook since then. Someone else had been present. Someone else had been waiting. Or the death record was wrong and Evers was still alive at 80-something, coming back to a booth in a building in a small town in Ohio to sit in front of a painted-over window and look at an auditorium he used to run, present, waiting. Waiting for what? I went back on Monday. I had decided I was going to try the door one more time. I was going to use the key that had been left on my cart, which I still had in my pocket, had been carrying for weeks. And I was going to push the door and see what happened. Maybe the thumb turn had been disengaged. Maybe whoever left the key had left it, specifically so that I could get in. That last thought frightened me and pulled me toward it simultaneously, which I recognized as a form of something psychological that I didn't fully understand but which felt true. I worked through my night as normally as I could. I finished auditoriums 1, 2, and 3. I went through the lobby. I did the restrooms. It was around 1:30 when I came back to the hallway. I stood in front of the door for a moment. Then I put the key in the lock and turned it. I put my hand on the knob. I pushed. The door swung open. The thumb turn was disengaged. The door opened. I stood in the doorway of Auditorium 4. The room was dark except for the exit signs on either side of the screen, which cast their faint green light into the corners. The green of exit signs at that hour has a quality that's difficult to describe. It's not threatening exactly, but it is specific. It belongs to a certain space between dark and light that doesn't exist anywhere else. In that light, the auditorium was fully visible in its shapes, if not its details. 90 seats, 12 rows. The center section, rows F through J, seats 10 through 16 in the compression of use. The screen, the floor, swept. The white cloth on seat H-12, folded, placed. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I did not go inside. I stood on the threshold and I looked at the room and I breathed. It smelled like any auditorium, that particular mixture of age and cleanliness. The faint ghost of popcorn and the something beneath it that belongs to rooms where many people have sat in the dark together. The room smelled like a movie theater. It smelled cared for. I looked at the seat with the cloth. I looked at the compression of the other seats. I looked at the exit signs. I didn't cross the threshold. Then from somewhere above the projection booth, or the ceiling, or the space between them, I heard the sound. The sound I'd been hearing for months. Low, rhythmic, slow. Not threatening, not exactly welcoming. Something between those things. The way the exit sign light was between things. The sound of someone who has been in a place a very long time. I pulled the door closed. I took the key out. I looked at the tarnished knob. Then I did the one thing I hadn't expected to do. I put the key through the crack in the door, the gap at the bottom, the 1/4-inch gap where light might show and carpet compression might be visible. I slid it through. I stood up. The key was on the inside now. I walked up the hallway. I got my cart. I finished the night. I gave notice on a Wednesday in early September. I called Dale and told him I was moving on. He didn't ask why, which I noticed. He said he'd process my final check, which arrived by mail the following week. The morning I cleaned out my supply card, I found a note on it, a piece of lined paper, handwritten. The handwriting was neat and precise, the same hand I'd seen in the logbook. The note said, "Thank you for your care of the building. The door will stay as you left it, that's all." I stood in the hallway with the note in my hand. Then I put it in my notebook. I've thought about this for years now. I thought about what I know and what I don't, and whether the space between them means anything. What I know, Something was happening in Auditorium 4. Someone was maintaining it, using it, locking it from the inside. The pattern went back at least 30 years, maybe longer. The people who managed the building knew about it and had decided at some point that the right response was containment and quiet. What I don't know, who the man in the projection booth was, whether he was Paul Evers or someone else, whether the logbook entries of present waiting were the record of a person doing something ordinary or something else entirely, whether whatever he was waiting for ever arrived. What I can tell you is what the room felt like when I stood in the doorway. It felt like a room that was being kept for someone. The way you keep a room ready when someone is expected and you want them to know that everything is in order. Seats adjusted, floor swept, cloth folded, trash replaced. The room was clean. Someone made sure it was clean. I don't know if that person was human in the full sense of that word, and I don't know if it matters. What I know is that the door is now unlocked from the inside. That was my last act there. I can't tell you with certainty why I did it. Maybe because I thought whoever was waiting in that room had waited long enough. Maybe because I wanted there to be a way in and a way out that wasn't only controlled by one side. Maybe because when I stood in that doorway at 1:30 in the morning in a small town theater in Ohio, with the exit signs green in the dark and the seats waiting in the dark and the cloth folded on its seat, I didn't feel fear. Not fear exactly. I felt like I had walked into something that had been going on for much longer than me and would go on for much longer after me. Like a river you step into and then step out of, and the river continues. The river was always there. The river didn't need you, but it allowed you to pass through. That's the best way I can put it. The Orrton Rex is still open as far as I know. Still showing movies on weekends. Still staffed by Carol and Henry, presumably. Still cleaned at night by whoever Meridian sends. I wonder sometimes if they notice the inventory. I wonder if they're keeping a notebook. I wonder if the door to 4 is still unlocked. I wonder what happens when something has been waiting for 30 years and the door is finally opened. I don't go back to find out. Some things stay closed, Henry said, because it's better for them to stay closed. He was talking about the door. I think he was also talking about the questions. He was right, probably. But I kept the notebook. I'm still adding to it. There's one more thing I want to tell you. One thing I haven't mentioned, because I wasn't sure how to frame it, and I'm still not sure. But I think you should know it. On my last night at the Rex, after I slid the key under the door and stood up in the hallway, I walked back toward the lobby. I had about an hour left in my shift. I was going to do the final checks and leave. I was in the lobby near the concession stand when I heard the auditorium door. Not footsteps from the hallway. The door itself. The specific sound of a door opening. Not mine. I had come the other way. And then a long moment of quiet. And then the door closing again. I stood at the concession counter. I didn't go back. In the morning, when I went down the hallway, one last time with my cart, the door to 4 was closed. The tarnished knob was the same as always. The sign, Auditorium 4, closed for renovation, do not enter, was in its plastic tape on the door. I reached out and tried the knob. It turned fully, opened freely, with the easy rotation of an unobstructed lock. I looked through the doorway. The room was the same. The seats, the screen, the exit signs. The cloth on seat H-12 was gone. The room was empty, cleaned, as it always was, and I stood there for a moment in the doorway of a room that had been closed for 30 years, that had been maintained by someone or something for 30 years, that had been waited in and kept and returned to for reasons I will never fully know. And I breathed the specific air of it, movie theater air, the sweet staleness of it, the particular quality of a space where people have sat in the dark together watching light, and then I stepped back and I pulled the door closed and I walked up the hallway and I let it go. Some things stay closed. I left the building at 6:04. I drove east on the main street of Orrton until it became County Route 18, and then I drove west on 70 back toward Columbus, and the morning was coming up gray and cool over the flat Ohio farmland. And I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. But every time I'm in a long hallway at night with a door at the end of it, I think about that room. I think about the cloth, folded, the seats in the middle of the house, the logbook full of dates in neat, careful handwriting, the feeling of 30 years of waiting condensed into 90 seats and one exit sign, and the quiet that lives in old buildings after the people have gone. Present. Waiting. I still don't know what it was waiting for. I don't think I want to. That's the story. That's all of it, or all of it I know. I kept the notebook. I still have it. I haven't been back to Orrton. I don't know if what I experienced was a man, a very old, very private man, with a decades-long attachment to a room, or something else. I don't know if the distinction matters. What I know is that for 8 months, I cleaned a small-town theater in Ohio. And every night I walked past a door that was locked from the inside, and when I finally opened it, something on the other side walked out. I hope wherever it was going it arrived safely. That's the best I can wish it.